I'm Amy Clark, and I'm the chair of the Communication Studies Department at the University of Virginia's College at Wise. I'm also co-founder of the Center for Appalachian Studies. Well, growing up, we had always heard about it. The older generations in our family talked about what they called a slave cemetery on the property. And when I was little, I went with my family members a couple of times into the woods where we looked for the graves, and I vaguely remember finding some rocks, some stones that seemed to mark them. They didn't tell us a lot about them. They didn't seem to remember a lot about them, only that they had been told that slaves had been buried there, or once enslaved people had been buried there. And then I started to ask my grandmother more questions, and she didn't remember a lot.
This is Rita Humphrey of Jonesville, Virginia, and my grandmother, Cheney Russell, told me that the slave cemetery was up on the hill. It's in the woods. And, of course, that was many years ago, and nobody knew who was buried up there. I mean, they only put rocks up at the head and the foot of the graves. And I don't remember how many we counted. Was it 6 or 8?
Maybe a few more.
I had no idea who they were or anything, but it was back during when the early time when they had slaves to help on the farm.
She remembered her grandmother saying that they had once lived on the property owned by the woman that she was a sharecropper for. So that gave me a little bit more information. But she also said that she remembered there used to be a cornfield near this section of the woods where the graves were, and that they were always to hoe around them but never to touch them. So I thought that was interesting. So that was about as far as I got. Later on, when I started to write more, and I was thinking of things I wanted to write about, I write a lot about my family. I thought, well, I'm going to pursue this a little bit more, and I really dug in and started to try to do some research. And with my granny's help, I found a little bit more information, nothing conclusive, but we have a lot of evidence now to suggest that these graves did belong to once enslaved people. Once I had the name of the woman that owned the land before my granny.
What was her name?
Her name was Mary Skidmore, Mary Roop Skidmore. She was a Roop at that time. My great-great-grandmother, her name was Cheney Russell. She sharecropped for this woman, and she was the one that told my granny the story about the graves. I found out that this death portrait that had been hanging on my great-grandmother's wall for years and years actually included Mary. There's a portrait of my great-great-aunt who died at 13 in her casket, which was not unusual for the time. You know, this would have been 1920s, 1910, something like that. And Mary is standing behind the casket with the family. So once I had that information, I was able to trace that to her father, Maston Collier, who family lore said was a slave owner. And the best piece of information I got was from some of my relatives who do a lot of genealogy, and they had a picture of Mary and her father and her mother and her husband, and a piece of a blanket that they said had been woven by his slaves, and that when she married her husband, that Maston sent several of them to live with her, which is how they might have ended up on my grandmother's land. And so that was a big piece of information. And so from there, we started looking in the census records to see if we could find evidence of his having owned slaves. And so far, I think the best piece of evidence to that we found is the 1870 census that lists, I think, 3 people living in his household with his last name who are identified as black. When you are researching people, you know, and using their graves, normally it's easy because you have names, you have dates of birth and death, you know, you have that information and it's traceable. But with African Americans, particularly before and during the Civil War and just after, there is no identifying information other than sex and race on a census. You don't have names, unfortunately. So they call this the wall, people who do this kind of research, because you go so far and then you can't go any further because you don't have that information. So you have to rely on family lore, which is what I've done. You have to rely on what your family has told you or some kind of written record that family has put down, and hope that there are names in that written record that you can follow, and just sort of piecing it together. But I think that's been the biggest obstacle is what we have are graves with rocks on top, but very little else other than what I remember family telling me. Well, I do this as I can, as time allows, but I think continuing the search for more evidence, I guess, as we piece this together to make this more conclusive, if possible. I'm relying a great deal on my colleague Brian McKnight, who's an Appalachian historian, to give me sort of the context, how life would have been at that time, and what would have probably been the norm and what would have been unusual. It would not have been unusual, for example, for those people to still be living with Maston because, after emancipation, those people of color who were free chose to live the places where they had lived, especially if they'd been treated well. So that would not have been unusual. And it also offers strong possibilities because he was wealthy that was the case. So more material like this, I think, would be helpful, just continuing to dig and to find more documents. I would like to eventually get a grant, possibly, to take it a little further and perhaps do some mapping of the cemetery using ground mapping technology. I'd like to find some consultants who could tell us a little bit more about why the graves are positioned. They appear to be, and I'm not sure, but they appear to be positioned a certain way. In one section of the cemetery, the graves appear to encircle a tree that's very, very old. So I need to know more about burial customs and why that might be the case. I want to know their names. I think for me that's been the driving, I want to know their names and maybe put their names there. I want to, ultimately, I need to make this a protected spot. I need to have it registered so that whoever is buried there, is recognized.
My name is Ron Carson, and we are sitting in the Appalachian African American Cultural Center, located in Pennington Gap, Virginia. We live in an area, and I identify it as extreme Southwest Virginia, in mainly the 9 coal fields of Southwest Virginia, where very little, if any, is written on blacks. We have a dear friend, Dr. Turner, Bill Turner, who actually did some work up in southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, but nothing is done over here in Southwest Virginia. My goal, and I believe my wife's goal, is to try to document the African American experience of this area. Lee County, mainly Lee County, Wise County, Scott County, Buchanan County, Dickerson County, Russell County. These are the areas where we know that at some point in time, just by what we have discovered, that there were blacks in this area. But as we sit here today, out of 800 children in the public high school, you have 3. So that's very indicative that this area has lost the black population. So our goal is to research to find out exactly how many blacks were in this area pre-Civil War, post-Civil War, and then to understand why the migration of this area, what happened. Over the years, Jill and I have actually worked with the Lee County Historical Society on tracing back the history of Lee County, and stories that I've heard that well, Ron, there was never a lot of slaves in Lee County, or there may have been no slaves in Lee County. Well, we know that to be false, but there were slaves here. But the reason that what they have told me is that everyone was so poor, indigent servants, that the poor people and the black people were on the same level. And I just don't find that to be, I just don't buy that. But, several teachers taught our kids that, in school, in the public schools, that, there was limited slaves in this area, and that the Civil War was over livestock, it was over the fight over chickens and cattle, and it wasn't about slavery. So we are a very small black community, and you can go through town and you probably wouldn't see a black person. You may see one walking down the street. You go to the grocery stores, you just don't see the black people. But people in power in this county, and I like to call them the haves and the have-nots. The haves just pretty much have just isolated the whole entire black community. I do go to a church called Wells Chapel Church. Actually, my great-great-grandmother built that church. Where we are sitting now, this whole hillside at one time was all her property. And the church is very small, maybe 14, 15 members. But the members of that church, you do not see them out in the community. It's like you don't exist. You don't exist. From a black perspective, I think I've heard some black people say, I don't want to remember the past. It's too painful. Well, I feel the opposite. If you don't know where you came from, how in the heck do you know where you're going or where you are right now and what your vision is for the future?
Well, when I got the research grant from UVA-Wise, we knew that Dr. Herman would be coming, and so we picked a day to come and do some clearing because we knew that the GPS would need a clear ground to be able to read what was underneath.
We saw, there were several trees that you can see that were down, and so we had the chainsaws out, we had the weed eaters out, and we just cleared off a lot of the ivy that was on the ground.
And in the process of clearing, we actually found more stones
yes,
that we didn't know, and we suspect maybe it's even a wider site than we thought it was before. I thought that some of the stones were in circles, but actually after it was cleared, you can see sort of a grid. Some of them are in clusters, which may indicate family, but you can see they're spaced apart, sort of 3 to 5 feet apart. And we also saw that there are headstones and footstones. We didn't know that before. We just thought they were random stones. But some of the headstones are clearly bigger and the footstones are smaller.
My name's Rhett Herman. I'm with Radford University. I'm in the physics department. So today, my goal here is to be able to use our ground penetrating radar unit to possibly see what we can see under the ground. The GPR unit has the ability to be able to detect the disturbances that could indicate the presence of burials. The burials do have a very distinct look on the GPR screen. After we get the data here in the field, I'll sit down, put all the raw data on my computer. I will process the data, and I will give to Amy a series of plan view images that hopefully will show a series of regular disturbances in the ground that could be indicative of a burial. That's the kind of echo that I classically see.
Oh, well.
Boom, 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 boom. There's 1, 2, 3, 4.